Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us at the Winter Show. We're delighted to have you here for this year's edition of America's Leading Art, Antiques, and Design Show. As you may know, the Winter Show is not just a celebration of exceptional art and craftsmanship, it's also a benefit for Eastside House Settlement, an organization that was founded in 1891 to help serve New York's most in-need population. So we're very grateful for all of you being here today and for supporting not only the show and our panelists and all of our dealers, but also for your support of Eastside House as well. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's panel discussion, Crosscurrents, Cultural Exchange in the 18th Century, which we are delighted to be presenting in collaboration with Master Drawings Week and the Drawing Foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor. Listen, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for braving the rain today and joining us. This is actually our first event of the week, so we're super excited to be opening the week in the Winter Show. So thank you so much for hosting us. My name is Allison Wisher. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Drawing Foundation. We are a nonprofit dedicated to the study and appreciation of drawings. And this, again, as I said, is the first event of 15 events that we're hosting between now and February 8th to coincide with Master Drawings New York. We hope you'll join us for more events this week. Please visit our website to learn more about our events and our mission. We're so pleased to once again be working with the Winter Show here at the Armory. And thank you to my colleagues at the Drawing Foundation, Simon Levinson, Daniella Berman, and Sam Blumenfeld for their help in organizing this event. Thank you also to our partners at Master Drawings New York for supporting our programming this week and every year for Master Drawings. In addition to attending our events, we hope you will take advantage of the 29 gallery exhibitions on view this week as part of Master Drawings New York 2025. Our panel discussion today, Crosscurrents, Cultural Exchange in the 18th Century, will include 3 presentations, followed by a conversation led by our moderator, Daniella Berman. Daniella is not only the head of our special projects and strategic initiatives here at the Drawing Foundation, but is also a specialist of European art of the 18th and 19th centuries. She has contributed to numerous exhibitions and publications in addition to serving as vice president of the Historians of the 18th Century Art and Architecture, HECA, and a board member of the Association of Historians of 19th Century, AHNCA. Is there an easier way of saying that? ANCA, there you go. We specialize in that. We are in excellent hands with her at the helm of this panel. Now I will pass the mic to Daniella to introduce the panel and our speakers for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison, for the introduction, and my thanks also to the Winter Show team for co-hosting this panel with the Drawing Foundation, and especially to Helen and to Lane for all their work, and to Anderson and Jason for invaluable tech support that will continue to be needed, I'm sure. So as Allison mentioned, in one of my other hats, I serve as the Vice President of the Historians of 18th Century Art and Architecture, and it's a particular pleasure, therefore, to gather other people passionate about the 18th century to explore a topic that I love so much. As many in this room know, the Grand Tour was a trip undertaken most often by wealthy aristocrats from England and then increasingly from the rest of the European continent to Italy. It became a sort of rite of passage from the late 17th century through the early 19th century and reaching its peak in the 18th century as part of a broader interwoven story of cross-cultural exchange facilitated by a robust network of trade routes. Artists embarked on voyages not only to document new cultures being encountered, both in terms of new types of flora and fauna and environments, but also to expand their education. And in my own work on the French artist Jacques-Louis David and his students, for example, David, who was recently described as a boring draftsman by someone in the room, I disagree. But David was profoundly influenced by his time in Rome. His drawings from that period were reassembled into albums and served as a kind of reference library of vocabulary that he returned to throughout his career and that his students also used throughout their careers for select motifs and things and inspiration in other ways. So today we wanted to bring together a group of experts who each had a distinct vantage point on both the Grand Tour, as it's been traditionally understood, and also our expanding notions of it. We have three wonderful speakers who will each offer some short remarks, and then we'll dive into a discussion, as Allison said, before opening it up to questions from you all. So our first speaker is Johnny Yarker, who is a leading dealer in British art. He has written extensively on British art of the 18th century and the Grand Tour in particular, and is currently working on a book-length study of the British community in Rome entitled Savage Pilgrims, Rome, the British, and the Grand Tour, 1750 to 1798.
Thank you so much, Anna, for that very generous introduction. And I'm sorry, guilty as charged. I was the one that rather flippantly referred to David as not always the most scintillating draftsman. I'm talking to you today with a sort of dual capacity, both my kind of passion for foreign communities in Rome in the 18th century, but also to give you a little bit of a commercial perspective. And I'm going to end up with a few sort of ideas about the market, which I hope will be of some interest given what's going on this week and the opportunity to both look but also think about acquisition of drawings. I thought I'd start with a kind of fairly typical image, as it were, the paradigm, the idea of the Grand Tour as a rite of passage, exactly as Daniella said, for elite, principally men, traveling from northern countries, I would argue principally England at this moment, to Rome to undertake a period of prolonged programmatic study. This is the kind of image we associate with that idea. Wonderful portrait attributed relatively recently by the late, great Alistair Lang to John Brown. You see a group of British toffs discoursing amongst ruins of the Palatine. The man in the middle pointing is the resident Scottish cicerone or antiquary, James Byers. So far, so conventional. My own work tries to move away from the biographical obsession that we have with the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour studies has been largely dominated by the most remarkable text in the last 25, 30 years. I'm talking about, of course, John Ingermell's masterful digest of Brinsley Ford's archive, the Dictionary of English and Irish Travellers to Italy. It's a wonderful resource, rich, deep, incredibly fulfilling to dive into. But it has slightly forced the biography as the preferred methodology for discussing travel to Rome. And of course, biography has its place. It's always interesting to think of the motivations of a single operative in traveling to Italy, their acquisitions and their patronage. But I'm interested slightly more in taking a broader historical and socio-political and economic view of why is it that Rome, after about 1760, becomes such a locus for travel, not just for the very rich, but for an increasingly bourgeois audience, for artists, and I would argue the literally thousands of names that don't appear in the dictionary. I recently was working in the state papers in Kew for a little-known consul in Livorno, a British consul in Livorno, and he, in exasperation, submits his quarterly accounts to the Southern Department, that's the Foreign Office in London, and in it he lists 360 names of people he has given money to, British citizens in Livorno he has given money to, and these are sailors. They are the widows of sailors. They are, one of them was a maid to a visiting grand tourist who got pregnant and was left behind. There's a whole social structure in Grand Tour Italy that has been completely ignored by our focus on elite travel. That's one element of my research. But what I'm really interested in is why. Why is it that Rome in the 1770s, 60s, 70s, 80s, is it such a destination for Brits? Well, to sort of paraphrase Lord Devine, it's a large percentage, Italy had the art and Britain had the money. This bilateral relationship is extremely important, and it is largely an economic one, but it's an economic one of political necessity. And something that we're really bad at when we're thinking about the Grand Tour is remembering that Italy's full of Italians. If you read most accounts of Grand Tour travel, of Grand Tour artists, it is largely about foreigners operating in isolation in Rome. But don't forget, Rome is governed by an extraordinarily brilliant, enlightened group of men, the Curia, with the Pope at its helm. And there's one man who I'd like to just highlight, and that's Cardinal Alessandro Albani. I'm showing you in glorious Technicolor for the first time since this house has been largely inaccessible to scholars for the last 100 years. But the Fondazione Tolonia are now allowing photography. So you can see this wonderful, the Galleria, the main gallery in Villa Albani. Albani was an extraordinary man. In brief, because I'm aware that I could talk for hours on this, but in brief, he is thrown into the British sphere of influence during the War of Austrian Succession. He's very allied with the Habsburgs and with the Savoys in Turin. And he realizes that Rome is missing a trick. If it is to remain a politically potent actor on the European stage and not be crushed by competing concerns of the Catholic monarchies, it needs more money. And he realizes they're going to get the money from Britain. And so he starts this creep, this gradual political creep to ally Rome to the Hanoverians. Not overtly, Britain has no diplomatic relations in Rome in the 18th century, but just gradually. Why does it have no diplomatic relations? Because if you were to visit Rome in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, you would find the arms of the King of England were proudly displayed above Palazzo Muti in the center of Rome. Not King George III, but of course the old pretender, James Edward Stuart. And the presence of the Jacobites by the 1760s had become a real embarrassment and a real impediment for British travel. And so Albani, with extraordinary far-reaching cultural policy, makes Rome incredibly attractive to the British. He undermines the Jacobites, eventually getting the royal arms removed in 1766, and instituting a series of incredibly clever cultural policies. For example, he opens up excavations to foreign actors. So suddenly, in the 1760s, the most enormous amount of antique material is coming out, being dug up around Rome for the first time in several centuries. So much, in fact, that they're forced to found their own museum to house it, the Museo Pio Clementino. And it means that the average British squire can suddenly acquire great antiquities. But he turns his palace on the Via Salaria into an amazing laboratory of neoclassicism. You look up, the ceiling is by Mengs. His librarian was Winkelmann. You can imagine all the pensionnaires from the Académie de France à Rome working in the garden. We have albums of drawings by Hubert Robert, by Natoire, all working in this incredibly precocious space. And into that you throw someone like Robert Adam, whose first day in Rome he goes to Villa Albani. And Adam, I would argue, is the first great interior decorator, and he understands that with a man like Albani, you can do it all. You can buy the antiquities, you can find an architect, you can find an Italian to paint, and he imports that wholesale into Britain. And I'm just showing you there a Robert of the colonnade, so that's just outside the gallery. But of course, Rome is also the locus for great cross-sections and intersections and transnational exchange between groups of artists. And I'm showing you two images that are so potent for that. And this is something in my own work and in my own commercial life I'm extremely interested in. What are the chains of influence? What are the relationships? We know, I'm working on Right of Derby at the moment, we know that he spends almost 40 consecutive days working in the Académie de France à Rome. Who was he drawing next to? These are questions. British art is so often siloed that we don't ask these questions. We don't think hard enough about those kind of personal interactions. So here we have Fuseli drawing Sergel. Fuseli Swiss, but identifies largely as British. Sergel, of course, is Swedish, great sculptor. And you can imagine the people that were working in this circle. And Sergel's greatest commission in Rome was from a Brit. So there's all these connections. And next to it, a decade or so later, is a wonderful pastel in the V&A of Hugh Douglas Hamilton showing the Irish painter Henry Tresham with the great Italian sculptor Canova. And they are looking at a sculpture that was commissioned again by a Brit. Canova's career begins and is stimulated by the British wealth presence in Rome at this moment. And I suppose what I'm really excited about is what happens to artists when they get to Italy. And I'm just showing you three. Again, I think this is not about chain of influence. This is about three people simultaneously from the same generation being liberated by the experience of a new climate, a new culture, and one that is dedicated towards art making. So we have here a wonderful watercolor by Francis Town, by Joseph Wright of Derby, and this extraordinary plein air sketch in the Ashmolean by Thomas Jones. This is a remarkable formal moment. This is a moment at which a group of landscape makers step away from the conventions of picture making to produce these incredibly candid, very fresh representations of the world, which of course are so familiar to us because it goes on to be the great school of naturalism into the 19th century. So I'm really interested in how this kind of aesthetic leap takes place, and then the reverberations. Watercolor becomes a great medium in Rome in the 1770s, and not just amongst the British. Think of the German painter Hackert, or Lucieri, or the Swiss Ducrot. They all adopt watercolor. And I'm not saying it's a chain of influence, it's just these patterns are happening simultaneously. And I think that we can be bolder in making these associations. With my commercial hat on, I have to say it's very exciting because you can still buy these works. These works are still out there. Unlike many of the masterpieces of sort of other schools, this material is still readily available. I'm showing you, this is a beautiful exhibition that's just opened in Houston of British drawings, and I'm just showing you one wall. This collection was formed over the last 10 years. When I went to Houston a decade ago, I asked to look at the British drawings. They bought about a box, showed me 7 mounts, and said, that's it. There are now over 80 drawings in the collection, and you have here 4 of the great monuments of Grand Tour British drawing. On the left, Francistown, a 1781 monochrome view of Lake Albano. Next to it, a Beckford Cousins. Next to it, a great Thomas Jones. Next to that, a Dartmouth Wilson. And I was asked to say a few words down in Houston, and I said, well, looking at this wall, you've got 3 of the outstanding categories of drawing made in the 18th century by British artists. Which one of these do you think the British Museum doesn't have? The answer, of course, they haven't got any of them. So it's an extraordinary what can still be achieved. And to end on a shameless plug, I have the most ravishing and beautiful oil sketch by Thomas Jones on my stand. So come by later and have a look.
That's great. Thank you so much, Johnny. That was great. Our next speaker is Alan Templeton. Alan has been collecting art since 2000, mainly to benefit the museums of Northern California. He's been a guest curator at both the Crocker Art Museum and the UC Berkeley Art Museum, including monographic exhibitions on William Hogarth and Giovanni Battista Piranesi. He exhibited his own artwork from 1987 onwards, and his drawings are represented by Vorpal, am I saying that right? Vorpal Gallery, 1997 to 2002.
All right, thank you very much. Here, I thought we'll start at the early 18th century. Much of 18th century art portrays the poetry of everyday life. It's part of the reason I like it so much. And the images are often suffused with wit and charm and are gently idealized. And you see all of that here. Giuseppe Maria Crespi from Bologna. This is from about 1705. In around 1690, he took a very important study trip to Venice that greatly influenced him. This is the thing, it's not just about grand tours, it's also about petite tours. And that's doubly true in Italy. He went back to Bologna. He occasionally went to Florence, but most of the time he was in Bologna. A lot of people came to him, both artists and collectors. The one I like the most of those people who went to work with him, it's Piazzetta, one of the great artists of the 18th century. And here, this is very typical of his art, where it's his son Giacomo feeding a dog while a neighborhood friend looks on. And so it's very poetic. The technique is superb. The use of chalk in the 18th century reaches a very high level. Now, both with Piazzetta and Crespi, you can still find their work. Many are still in private hands. They're not cheap, but they are very good. Here, so if you cannot afford an original drawing by Piazzetta, you can always buy an engraving by Piteri, Marco Piteri, who was commissioned by Piazzetta to create more than 140 engravings after works by Piazzetta. And this reflects there's this growing middle class in the 18th century. So then, as now, the prints are much more affordable. But you can see the technique is superb. So 18th century engravings have a very high skill level, and these are often in the thousands, so maybe from between 1,000 and 20,000, you can get a very good one. Meanwhile, back in France, we have Watteau in Paris. Keep in mind, he grew up in Valenciennes, which is the part of Flanders that's ruled by France. And I think it makes sense to see Watteau's art as a combination of what's going on in Flanders and what's going on in Paris. This is someone who drew almost every day, and that shows. And the technique, this is one of the drawings I'll show you that I've given to the Crocker Art Museum. It's a beautiful work. Now, Watteau never goes out of style. These are not inexpensive, but no collection is complete without one. His technique with the colored chalks is superb. And whether it's a small drawing like this or one of the large paintings, you see his combination of careful observation, gently idealized, and then it creates this timeless quality. They're irresistible. Here is Rosalba Carriera, the great pastel artist from Venice. But she too, she traveled, and in fact, she spent a year and a half in Paris, 1720 to 21, invited by the collector Crozat, and she became fast friends with Watteau. Between them, Watteau and Rosalba, they influence everyone in this period, essentially. And so a lot of what we think of as 18th century art, it's because of the two of them plus Crespi. Those three had this enormous impact. A lot of what I'm going to show you today has been going down in price. It's the opposite here. Rosalba is more popular than ever. I don't see that changing anytime soon. The thing about Rosalba, not only is she a good portraitist, but she has this mastery with the medium of pastel. And if she liked the sitter, she drew a better portrait. And I think she got along well with Lord Middleton because she went to a lot of trouble in the clothing, in the face. I think you get a sense of his personality just by looking here. He's best known, by the way, the sitter, for being the co-founder of the Rules of Cricket. So keep in mind, all sorts of people went on a grand tour, not just erudite people. But he wrote back excitedly from Venice that Rosalba had drawn his portrait and that he was very pleased with it. All right, now this is the next generation. This is Perronneau. He is a superb portraitist, and his command of pastel is unsurpassed. But I can tell you, in the time I've been collecting, the prices have gradually been going down for Perronneau. They're much more affordable now than they were 20 or 25 years ago. I don't know why, but his ability to capture a personality and the spontaneity that is suggested is superb. So this is the one I gave the Crocker. This is the one at the Met. They're both superb examples. The only difference is the Met bought theirs 20 years before I bought mine. And in that time, the prices have gone down. So keep that in mind. Now, here's Claude-Joseph Vernet, one of the great view painters and draftsmen of the 18th century. He's from Avignon in southern France, but he spent nearly 20 years of his career in Italy, Rome, Naples, in the countryside. He learned from everyone. He became a superb view painter. After those 20 years, the King of France asked him, and when I say asked, I mean he told him to come back to France. And he did extremely well, but it's really Italy that formed him. And here, it's a pair of drawings. This is early in the morning, the boats are going out, the fishing boat, and you see the mist. Later in the day, they've come back. It's life in a fishing village. All of these artists I'm showing, regardless of the station of the subject, whether it's a fisherman or someone very important, each is given great attention. And there's this sympathy that suffuses a lot of the art of the 18th century that I find very compelling. It's this sensitivity to feeling, to personality, and to beauty. And here again, it's the poetry of everyday life. Now, this is a Dutch picture. You might be forgiven for thinking it's French, but this is by Dirk van der Aa. There's a lot of good 18th century Dutch art. A lot of people who really like Dutch art don't buy it because it looks too French to them. Don't let that stop you. He's a superb draftsman. He's spent virtually his whole career in The Hague. But you can see that here in the later 18th century, mid to late 18th century, the styles have become very international. And here, this is Fugger, Heinrich Friedrich Fugger, who's from Swabia, but he spent the majority of his career in Vienna. However, he spent 7 years in Italy, and that too was the forming of him. Now it's neoclassical, but you can see it's still suffused with wit and humor. It's the three graces, discovering Cupid. You know he's only going to be trouble. The technique is superb, and it shows you here too. I defy you to show me anything that is particularly German about this drawing. This could have been made by any number of talented artists. And whether it's Rococo or neoclassical, these movements are very international. There's a melding in the 18th century of different traditions. And it's charming. I think I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Alan. That's great. Everyone's going to start running around looking for these drawings now. Our last speaker before we jump to our discussion is Laurel O. Peterson, who is the Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Yale Center for British Art. Laurel specializes in British works on paper produced during the long 18th century. Her current exhibition projects, the first one we'll hear about a little today, Painters, Ports, and Prophets, Artists and the East India Company, 1760 to 1830, which opens at the Yale Center for British Art in January 2026 and is co-curated with Holly Schaefer at Brown University. And her other current exhibition project is on the artist Michel Jean Casabon, 1813 to 1888. Previously, she served as the organizing curator of John Singer Sargent Portraits in Charcoal in 2019 and is co-curator of Architecture, Theater, and Fantasy Bibiana drawings from the Jules Fisher collection in 2021, both at the Morgan Library and Museum. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you, Daniella, for this invitation. And when Daniella approached me about speaking on this panel, I got very excited to think about this idea of Crosscurrents and a kind of grand tour in a much larger grand tour. So I'm going to zip you from Italy to India and to China. As Daniella mentioned, I'm working on this exhibition, Painters, Ports, and Prophets, with Holly Schaefer at Brown. And so I'm going to give a bit of an overview of some of the themes and works of art that we're highlighting in the show. The works are almost entirely from the Yale Center for British Art collection and really delve into rich caches of material, particularly from South Asia. So we focus on this period when the East India Company is gaining vast amounts of power in the Indian subcontinent. And it's a period when artists who are working under the auspices of the East India Company are creating these astonishing works of art. These are artists trained in India, they're trained in Britain, and they're trained in China. Many of whom we no longer know their names. Others are soldiers. Others have been trained in academies in Europe. And so for a long time, thinking about British artists in India, names like Johann Zaffini, of course, born in Germany, but works primarily in India and also goes on the Grand Tour in Italy, are names that are familiar, or artists like William Hodges. These are artists who are capturing magnificent sites in India to bring back to a British audience. But what the exhibition really wants to look at is the way in which artists are exchanging ideas, materials, drawing styles. The works are almost entirely works on paper. And to think about what happens when this large corporation begins to make a huge impact in India through ports throughout the subcontinent. And so I'm showing here a work by an artist trained in India of the Taj Mahal. The company was a joint stock corporation founded in 1600 and began as a sort of spice and textile trader. And then by the 18th century, it's also one of the largest armies in the world and gains increasing political control, which of course eventually results in the takeover by the British Crown. And during this turbulent and violent period, artists trained in India, China, and Britain grafted together multiple traditions of art making to cater to a global audience. And the exchange of materials, of artist materials, is also central to this story. So one of my favorite objects in the exhibition, which we acquired just a couple of years ago, is this astonishing bat by Bhavani Das. He was an artist commissioned by Lady Mary Impey, who traveled to India with her husband when he became a judge. And she was fascinated by the flora and fauna that she encountered in Calcutta and commissioned a trio of artists to make nearly 300 drawings of birds, bats, and flowers. It's a huge bat. Its wingspan can reach 5 feet. And so it extends to the very tips of 2 joined pieces of paper. But the artist has also rendered the bat with a really astonishing delicacy from the fur and its expressive face, as well as the kind of cartilage and sinews underneath the wings, using just a squirrel hair brush. And this Bhavani Das was an artist trained probably in a kind of Mughal court tradition, but is kind of tackling these large sheets of British paper with kind of an astonishing detail. The East India Company, we most often think of this period as related to India, but the East India Company is, of course, also trading and trying to trade in China and Southeast Asia, seeking tea and eventually trading in opium illegally in China. So this work of art comes out of the Malay Peninsula and is most likely for a company-related patron. It's one of 6 known versions. And we're seeing the leaves of a breadfruit plant sort of extended out, presenting the bounty of a fruit that fascinated Europeans in the 18th century. The breadfruit was first known to Europeans through the South Pacific, and Europeans saw it as this kind of magical natural bread because you can basically pick it off the tree and roast it in the ground and eat it. And it's a very nutritious, kind of starchy food to eat. The Royal Society spearheaded an effort to transplant this tree to Jamaica to serve as a food source for the enslaved population there. And there were efforts to bring the plant to India following the Bengal famine, in which 10 million people died. And so it's a real imperial commodity that's circulating. And amazingly, on the watermark of this paper is the watermark of the British East India Company. So it's actually on kind of official company paper. One of the things I've also been really excited about with this project is we've been thinking about we know that pigments and paper circulate, but we want to help people understand that and visualize it. And so I've been working with my colleagues at Yale's Institute for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage, working with conservation scientists to better understand the pigments that we're seeing and how they are used, and as well as with conservators. And so one of the first things that we did was shine UV lights over just about every work in the collection. And what we were looking for is this amazing, brilliant yellow fluorescence. And what this indicates, this bright yellow that you see around the eye of the yellow-eyed babbler, is the pigment Indian yellow, which is a pigment that's sourced only in India, the production of which was very secret until the late 19th century. The pigment is produced from the urine of cows who have been fed a diet exclusively of mango leaves. So it's a very inhumane process. Is a pigment no longer available, but it's very easily identifiable, and we know that it comes only from India. And we were excited to see that not only is that little eye fluorescing, but you can also see that the leaves are fluorescing as well. Which means that the yellow was used as a mixture as well as pure pigment. My colleague Richard Hark, who's a conservation scientist, used XRF, X-ray fluorescence, to make chemical maps of this drawing. And so what we're seeing here is mercury, iron, and lead, and I'm not a chemist, so don't ask me to get into too much detail, but we can tell a lot from these pigments. We know that the mercury is a vermilion, which is sourced from China. The brighter the color, the stronger the chemical signal. And so we're seeing a very strong iron presence in the center, which we've been able to confirm was Prussian blue, which is a pigment synthesized in Europe. So we have a Chinese pigment and a European pigment and an Indian pigment with the Indian yellow. And the lead also shows us that the artist is using the white paint kind of as a whiteout, which is a technique very commonly used in Mughal style painting, which we were able to sort of feel confident that the artist, although we don't know his or their names, was likely trained in a Mughal style. Although, interestingly, when this entered the YCBA collection, it came in as the work of George Edwards, who was an English botanical artist. One really important figure for the exhibition is an artist named Gangaram Tambat, who was trained in the city of Pune, now Pune. He was a sort of local popular artist who was commissioned by a company resident, Charles War Mallet, to produce these amazing drawings of temples. And Tambat was also a sculptor. He uses both European perspective and sort of the local perspective. And we see there's a group of artists using either like a viewing frame or a camera obscura in order to make a drawing of the temple on the hill. But one of the most astonishing works is this very large temple drawing of a facade that Gangaram Tambat made. And what we're looking at is a screen and then a space that recedes behind. And the drawing is now flat, but Gangaram would have wanted us to see it in 3 dimensions. There are strips that are slightly darker on either side, which actually would have folded forward as they represent, if you were a viewer, those elephants would have been on your left and right. And so he's kind of compensating for the lack of the vanishing point by kind of creating a physical perspective on the sheet. We see artists also working in multiple scales, looking at oil paintings and then sort of translating these oil paintings into smaller album sheets. And one of the most extraordinary objects that we'll have in the show is a 37-foot long scroll of Lucknow, the city of Lucknow, on the river Gumti. You see part of it extended here in our conservation lab. What depicts is this city that really flourished in the 18th century, the dynamic building program. There are temples, palaces, and wonderful boats shaped like animals. And the artists here are they're bringing together sort of the transparent watercolor technique of a British artist. The water, which is done in Prussian blue, is more heavily layered, more akin to an Indian tradition of drawing. It's done on Watman paper, British paper, joined together on a fabric backing. I mean, it's a delight to look at. And we still don't know who it was made for, whether it was for a British patron or a local patron. But and I mean, I was thinking last night, in this theme of cross currents on the current of the Gumti River, we're really seeing the traditions of these artists coming together. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So I love a panel that leaves you with the to-do list. We've got Houston ASAP and Yale coming up next year of places to visit. I wanted to just take a step back before we continue and ask you each, and Alan, you touched on this a little, what about the 18th century moment in particular interests you and how you landed here? Or did you land here? Or are you just dabbling?
I'm here to stay, I think. The 18th century for me is I think every historian thinks this, but it's when so much of the modern world comes into being, coalesces, our institutions, to an extent, politics, to an extent, economic practices. It's an extraordinary moment. It's also a moment in which, think of revolution, think of, I know that the contested word enlightenment, but it's also a moment at which the pre-disciplines start to assert themselves. So it's the moment at which the hierarchies of knowledge that we still live with today, in a sense, come into being. It's a moment of time, and I'm particularly interested in the second half of the century, when you can feel the tangible links between artistic creation and the sort of formation of society. And there are very relatively few moments, I think, where that is so palpable. But, you know, think of David, for example.
Oh, I
you know,
do.
Oh, you do. But, you know, David has an active role politically within, you know, the formation of post-revolutionary France. That doesn't happen very often. And so it's a very exciting moment at which there is this tangibility between the art production and the wider socioeconomic and political context of the moment. And it's what formed the modern world.
For my part, I would say it's the combination of extremely high technical ability along with depth and range of emotion. It's this huge panorama of expression. And also, I like wit and humor, and that's common in the 18th century. And I would say that the mistake some modern scholars make is that they take certain things too seriously that were meant to be seen as funny. So it's the humor, the emotion, and the technical skill, and the inventiveness. It's also the other thing. I mean, I really like the 17th century also, and what I tell people is, I admire the 17th century. I fell in love with the 18th century. That's the difference. The 18th century is about feeling.
I mean, I would echo a lot of what Johnny and Alan said, and you know, I also my 18th century always gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But I think that 18th century is sort of building on Johnny's point too, that it's a really interesting moment as a British art person and kind of the establishment of that we see kind of the establishment of academies and the place of art becoming more public during this period, as well as building off of longer traditions of art history. So it's, for me, it's a very exciting moment when art is changing a lot.
That makes sense. So in some of the examples you discussed today, and I think we have a range of stories to choose from, but how typical or representative are these of the kinds of cross-cultural exchange of the period, or are we really focusing on sort of anomalies?
No, I think that it's the great global century, or the first great global century, because, you know, from a British point of view, if you were to kind of flip this dynamic and think about London, well, the London art world doesn't come into being indigenously. It is entirely reliant on kind of migrant artists, you know, from Holbein to Van Dyck, to establish a kind of British visual tradition. But then in the 18th century, you know, who are the first academies being staffed by? They're being staffed by continental trained artists. Someone like Louis Chéron, for example, is hugely important. How does Gainsborough come into being? Well, he almost certainly spent time training with Gravelot, the French engraver. Hogarth couldn't make his prints without French technicians. I mean, the fact is that you know, without Bernard Baron, for example, you know, Hogarth could not have published Marriage à la Mode. So there is this, you know, Brexit is an ever-present cloud in our cultural life, the second Reformation. But you know, Britain in the 18th century was a porous society, and it was a very open society in lots of ways. And one of the, you know, the economic migrancy was enormous. You know, the sheer volume of Italian artists working in London in the 18th century. You know, this is the other thing. I mean, I made a joke about, we always forget the Italians live in Italy in the 18th century when we're talking about the Grand Tour. But this bilateralism, there's a lot of, there's so much going both ways. I just had a fascinating drawing that by a very, you know, sort of staid topographer, which was signed by a Dutch architect, because a Dutch architect and surveyor. We didn't know he was in London, but he came to London because that's where the money was, and he produced the complex urban, you know, orthogonals that this drawing was based on. So there's so much more work to be done transnationally and thinking about artists who move.
The thing I would say is I tried to show you some examples that are very representative. The thing I left out, because we didn't have very much time, is the 18th century is also very good at devotional art. And that's been given less attention, especially in our lifetime. But the point I would make there is that the artists I did show you, they give the same reverence and sympathy to these unknown, ordinary people as they do to the figures in the religious scenes. That there is this blurring of boundaries in the 18th century between the different categories. And likewise, some of the devotional scenes of the 18th century look a little bit like everyday genre scenes. So it's this blurring of categories that I think is intriguing, that is actually part of what the 18th century is about.
Yeah, I like this idea of blurring of categories. And one of the things that we're thinking a lot about in the exhibition is categorization of these works of art that are produced in Asia which have been kind of hived off as sort of British or Indian or Chinese, or called company school, often from India, or export art from China, when really they're all part of the same story. And I think that really cuts across. That's sort of one example in the 18th century, but I think that this movement of artists, of the way that the way that the art market works, the way that we sort of British school, Italian school, when actually there's a much more complex story at play.
Well, that's the pesky 19th century, because they separated everything up.
So that's why we have to stay in the 18th.
No, but I mean, this is a really, really important point about the way that scholarship has emerged in the sort of disciplinary age. In the 19th century in London, there is this terrifying separation of material. So topographical watercolors are not allowed to go into the British Museum collection. They go to the British Library. They're still there, uncatalogued, unphotographed, inaccessible. The India School material still in the British Library because it wasn't allowed to go into the British Museum. Architectural drawings went to the V&A, uncatalogued, unphotographed. It's this, we are still living with, to an extent, the kind of hyper drive towards specific disciplines that happens in the 19th century. I think things were, that blurring of categories is the ultimate 18th century factor. Sorry.
No, it's great. And that happens, I think, materially too. I was talking to somebody just before we started, right? Pastels, even now, are they paintings? Do you want to say something about that, Johnny? Are they paintings? Are they drawings, right? Where do they fall?
Yeah, I do want to say something about this because I think it's only the 20th century that doesn't understand that pastel is a serious art form. These artists in the 18th century who were using pastel, these are among the best artists. These were highly sought after. They're extraordinary. And they were treated with great respect. And another interesting thing about the 18th century is that I think it's the first century in which there are a number of collectors who choose to focus on drawings as their primary area. And with pride, many of these people, they could have afforded to buy other things. They just really like drawings. And so there too, the hierarchy of materials is very blurred in the 18th century. Every time I go to a pastel exhibit at a US museum, at some point the curator feels they have to apologize for showing pastels. It's nutty. So chalk, pastel, these are major media, and they should be treated as such.
I mean, pastel has the problem that it should be seen in candlelight or natural light, because the whole point of pastel, the Newtonian principle behind it, is that you have, the multiple facture of the pigment on the surface, and if you ever see a Lyotard or in candlelight, they literally speak. And that was, there's a lot of criticism in the 18th century about this, but because of the refraction, the faces move, and you have this kind of conversational. They were domestic objects: gold frame, plate glass, pastel, candlelight. And the problem with seeing lots of works on paper in museum conditions is the light levels are too high, too harsh, too white.
I would say not just, we can always talk about drawings, but not just about works on paper, right? You have the same thing for any medium from the material from the 18th century, right? One of the most brilliant moments, I think, for me was seeing the European Decorative Arts Court, Sculpture Court, at the Met by candlelight during an event, right? Like seeing those sculptures, they come to life totally differently. Laurel, did you have something you wanted to add on the topic of
pastel or
I mean, pastel, or I mean, your material focus is really interesting.
Yes, yeah. I mean, yeah, and I think that one of the things I think that can be really exciting with some of the works on paper and materials is that that if you can get audiences to look at them, they can really start to understand them. And so one of the things that we're thinking about for this exhibition is just providing multiple points of access to get people to really start thinking about the materials so that they are aware of them in other works of art that they encounter.
And I think that this question of the mythology of pastels, the mythology of some of these things really comes into play. I will say also, the mythology that the 19th century created around the Grand Tour and around these cross-cultural exchange is something that we're still battling. But even, Italy itself is a myth, right? Italy isn't unified until 1871. So even the idea of Italy as one entity is something that we have to sort of battle against as we delve into these topics. I want to bring in your distinct vantage points even more, and sort of we have a dealer, a collector, a curator, if we want to label things without the fluidity of the 18th century. And sort of what is it about these stories of cross-cultural exchange that you think are particularly salient to contemporary audiences?
So we live in an age now where there's this great desire to be more even-handed about all the different origins of different people, different traditions, and let's show good art from A to Z, which I support that. I think the 18th century was already doing that, and I think we can learn from it. It's a very international period in which a lot of people are trying to see beyond their own origin to a larger world of our ideas and expression. And so it is one of the great international ages. And I think that can be applied now. And I think just look at the fact that there are people in the 18th century who are either, they mainly collect drawings or they really love still lifes or all these things which grumpy older people said you shouldn't like as much. Nobody cared anymore. Another interesting thing about the 18th century is that they change the endings of certain old stories that they don't like because it's too tragic. And that even applies to the Bible and how certain stories are depicted in oratorios. And for instance, the killing of the daughter of Jephthah, which may not be on the tip of your tongue, but it's a very good story from the Old Testament. It's extremely dire. And so in the 18th century, the young woman is saved, and before the 18th century and from 1815 onwards, she always dies. So the way the 18th century rewrites things it doesn't like, it's maybe a little bit too modern, but it's intriguing.
Oh yes, King Lear always had a happy ending when played in London in the 18th century. No, seriously, you should read. The Garrick edition is extraordinary. Cordelia ends up sitting on her father's lap. But to answer your question, I think you can really only work on, collect, sell things that you love, things that are intellectually stimulating, things that you feel you can communicate something exciting, special, unique to someone else. That's what we're engaged in. We are ultimately, it's communication. You collect because you find something that really speaks to you in an object. But I can only sell an object if there's something in it that I feel that there's some integrity, some revealed idea, some greater communicative story. That's the only way you can sell something, because actually, otherwise, you might as well be selling secondhand cars. No offense to any secondhand cars dealers. It's an honourable profession.
I mean, I think with my curatorial hat on, I mean, thinking about sort of what we are hoping for in this story, these stories of the 18th century, is to kind of go back to Johnny's earlier point that this is about a formation of a modern the world that we live in. And with thinking about the East India Company, thinking about sort of the corporation and the stories that come out of this corporate takeover of a people, which is both a story that looks at really extraordinary works of art, but also has roots to some of the really pressing problems that we have today, and that we want people to feel that their stories are these stories are accessible, and that they learn something about the world that they lived in, as well as about the past.
That's great. I think also there's something particular about 18th century sociability that certainly all three of you sort of imbibe. And with that, we could keep talking just amongst us, but I think it's time to open the floor up. We have a microphone that is circulating that Anderson has. If there are questions in the audience, we're happy to take them. They can be particular, they can be general.
I just wondered, based on Johnny comments, were there any artists that were in the American continent that you felt were influenced by something?
It's a very prescient question because I'm just finishing an essay on exactly this topic. So the first great American-born painter to come to Europe is Benjamin West, who travels in 1760 and arrives in Rome, where he throws himself into the Albani milieu, and he's actually really trained by by Mengs. I mean, there's a sort of complicated story, but he sends back to America a group of copies after old masters, which were in Philadelphia, and they become the most important source material for European, Italian models, particularly Italian models, in America for the next 2 generations. So, for example, the young John Singleton Copley makes the journey from Boston to Philadelphia just to see them. And he gets very confused because somewhere the letter has gone missing. And there's a copy of a Madonna and Child, very much a sort of conventional Madonna and Child. And he writes a letter to his brother, stepbrother, Henry Pelham, saying, "I've seen this wonderful Correggio, and it's changed my life. This is how all painting should be." What he didn't realize is that it wasn't a copy of a Correggio, it was a copy of a Mengs. And it's extraordinary to think, to your point about this continuing interest in religious art, but it's so thrilling that Americanists, I think, are very resistant to thinking about the axis with the Grand Tour in the 18th century. But the material is legion, fascinating, and I would argue, I'm arguing in this essay, that that's why American art takes a certain route, is because Mengs and Correggio become this enameled quality. They're not interested in loose brushstrokes, they want tight painting. And that explains a lot about Copley, a lot about all the people West trained, from Peel to Trumbull. It's an extraordinary moment. Sorry, I've gone on too long.
But we could also have a debate about whether West is an American artist, right? I mean, we do.
I think he thought of himself as American, always. He didn't take his hat off in front of the king.
Now we all know what to do.
My question is, as you were talking about this opening up and forward momentum, what were the forces of reaction that they encountered, if any?
There's always some tension. You see that in the academies of fine art, that you see it in the marketplace. There are these differences of opinion. What should art be? What constitutes a success? And I think what happens in the 18th century is that there become many different answers to that, and it's a much freer period in the marketplace and intellectually. It is the beginning of something new, where partly what that means is people don't agree. And I think a big part of that is that there is this growing middle class, and their taste is not always the same as what the old families like. So you start getting many different opinions. You can be highly successful and as a still life painter and attract huge sums of money. And there are other people who think those people are crazy who are buying your art. So it's fragmented. But there is this desire in the 18th century to reassess old ideas, to look at the world with fresh eyes. And the way it makes the most sense to me is that the reverence that you see when Piazzetta is drawing the neighborhood children, and when he's drawing the Madonna and Child, he gives the same level of reverence to both. And I think that, to me, that's essential to what is special about the 18th century. That wouldn't have happened as readily at an earlier time. There is a freedom in the 18th century.
What I would say is that on a specific kind of micro British level, there was a lot of pushback. The Grand Tour, there was a lot of dissenting literature that's suggesting that actually travel to Italy was deleterious to the effects of a ruling elite, that actually you didn't want your ruling elite to pick up any continental habits. And you've got to remember that religion is still present. Whilst it's an age of skepticism, the fact is that the Anglican succession, the Hanoverian Anglican succession in Britain is extremely important. Protestantism is the absolute kind of political mantra. That is why travel to Rome, until the death of the Old Pretender in 1766, still there was the danger that you may be persuaded to become a Catholic, to support the Jacobites. This is a kind of constant anxiety. So you do get public debates and a lot of literature that pushes back, that says that it is this new fashion for travel to Italy is problematic because it may ultimately result in the return of Catholicism.
And I think too, back in Britain, there's increasing anxiety about the growing empire, and that there's interest in these works of art that are coming back from the Americas, from India, and then after following the American Revolution, there's a deep anxiety about about expanding control over the globe, and sort of the direction that that's taking, and that continues throughout the 19th century.
And then I would just add one other thing that happens sort of within the milieu of artists working together, right? And something that we as art historians are always sort of battling against is what gets put in writing and what is actual practice, right? And artistic practice and what gets discussed is often actually diametrically opposed. My favorite example of this is there's a lecture by Oudry that's read repeatedly in the French Academy, right? This art-making lecture about the kinds of grounds you should be using and how you should use a light ground followed by a ruddy ground to prepare your paintings in this case. And that's great, and it's sort of indoctrinated in this on the one hand, and on the other hand, when technical analysis is done of Oudry paintings, that's not what he's actually doing. So there's a do as I say, not as I do element, or maybe there's a repetition of that lecture because that's not what artists are doing. So there's this tension that sort of we always have to juggle between sort of the material evidence of what is actual artistic practice and sort of what is preached, I guess. And that on sort of within artist communities is also sort of present in different ways.
I have a quick question for you. The British Center for the Arts, which I always kind of go for the architecture, how the collection came to be. I mean, it's so odd, such a rich collection of British art inside a university.
So the Yale Center for British Art was founded opened in 1977, and was the vision of Paul Mellon, who was the son of Andrew Mellon. He began collecting British art in the mid 19th century and collected. I mean, he loved collecting collections. So we have the vast majority of our collection, it comes from Paul Mellon, and so to sort of speaking to the collecting of drawings, I mean, we have about 20,000 drawings and 40,000 prints, most of which were Mellon collections. And he saw British art very broadly and not just kind of produced in the British Isles, but the former British Empire, which is why we have this very rich material of material from South Asia.
The collection came first than the building.
He was collecting sort of privately and was looking for a place to to put his collection. And he was Yale class of 1929, and so it seemed like a fitting place for his collection to go. And the decision was so he was involved in the commissioning of Louis Kahn to build the building, and he gave it a very generous endowment as well. So we're thankful to Paul Mellon.
And in addition to the robust collection, I mean, I think that this was the note I kind of hoped to end on, is sort of what is it about drawings in particular? And the Paul Mellon collection is such a trove of drawings that when he was collecting, Paul Mellon was very much interested in the range of that material, that medium, and also sort of what can go in that category. And much like Alan said, sort of drawings have this special place. I wondered, Johnny, did you want to end us with a comment on drawings or any thought on drawings in particular?
Well, only that I have a wonderful group of drawings in the next room. So, but actually, no. Very, I mean, interestingly, from Paul Mellon, it's fascinating. I love kind of collecting stories, and Paul Mellon is one of those people who, before Paul Mellon's seismic entry into the market in the late 1950s, early 1960s, British drawings were incredibly cheap, and there was a huge middle-class urban collecting base. But Paul Mellon's essentially decimated the market because he came in and drove the prices up so enormously that actually kind of the tradition of collecting British drawings amongst a kind of educated British urban population essentially sort of fell by the wayside. And so it's a kind of really interesting collectors can have fascinating effects on the market.
Indeed, that seems like a great way to end our panel. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you to our speakers.